An 89-year-old man walked into a cafe and asked for a simple sandwich. His frail appearance didn't go unnoticed, and he was met with disdain and humiliation. Among the customers, a wealthy woman watched closely, her eyes fixed on something on his wrist. When she realized what it was, she froze, her heart racing as she approached him. The cafe buzzed with the usual chatter and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. It was a normal day, but that changed when the door opened, revealing an elderly man, thin and worn from life. His clothes were ragged, and his shoes barely covered his feet. He walked slowly, every step a battle between dignity and need. Old and exhausted, Joseph reached the counter, placing a few coins on it. Marcella, the cafe's owner, gave him a disgusted look. "This isn't a homeless shelter," she sneered. "If you don't have money, don't eat." "Please, just something small." Joseph's voice was barely a whisper. The murmurs of disapproval grew louder around him. His desperation was clear, but no one stepped forward to help. Marcella leaned in, her voice dripping with contempt. "We don't give out handouts. Go somewhere else." Quiet laughter rippled through the crowd as Joseph stood there, humiliated and frozen, unsure whether to leave or beg. Just as Joseph was about to give up, the cafe door opened again. An elegant woman entered Isabella, known in town for her wealth and influence. She immediately noticed the scene and walked confidently to the counter, her eyes focused on Joseph. "What's going on here?" Isabella asked, her voice firm. The cafe grew silent as all eyes turned to her. Marcella, caught off guard, tried to regain control. "This man can't be served here," she said, her arrogance fading under Isabella's steady gaze. Isabella ignored Marcella and smiled kindly at Joseph. "Don't worry, sir. Your lunch is on me today." Joseph stared at her in disbelief, tears welling in his eyes. Marcella, trying to assert herself, snapped, "We don't serve his kind here." Isabella's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened. "His kind? He's a human being just like everyone else here." The cafe, which had been filled with scorn moments earlier, now felt heavy with silence. The onlookers shifted uncomfortably as Isabella turned to Marcella. "I'll pay for whatever he needs," she said. "He has as much right to be here as anyone else." Marcella scoffed, attempting to push back. "We don't offer charity. If he can't pay, he doesn't belong." Isabella's eyes flashed with determination. "No one is asking for charity. I'll cover the cost. Or would you rather everyone see what kind of business you run?" The tension was palpable as Marcella hesitated, realizing she had no choice but to comply. She huffed and reluctantly prepared the sandwich, her hands shaking with frustration. The customers who had previously jeered at Joseph now sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. Isabella turned back to Joseph, who still clutched his few coins, trembling. She gently touched his hand. "You don't need to pay today. You've been through enough." Tears spilled from Joseph's eyes, and he whispered, "Thank you." Isabella nodded and helped him to a table, her presence a stark contrast to the hostility that had filled the cafe moments earlier. As Joseph sat, his sandwich finally in front of him, Isabella glanced down at his wrist. What she had noticed earlier was unmistakable, an old, worn wristwatch, the kind only given to military veterans decades ago. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it because her late father had worn the same one. Without another word, Isabella quietly paid for Joseph's meal and left, knowing she had done more than just buy a sandwich. She had restored dignity to a man who had given so much yet been treated with so little. "Business?" Isabella interrupted, an ironic smile on her lips. Businesses are made of people, Marcella. You seem to have forgotten that." She took a step closer to the counter, her voice now carrying across the café. "I've been a customer here for years, and I never imagined I'd witness something so inhumane." The whispers in the café fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. Marcella, flustered, knew Isabella's reputation carried weight in the city, but her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. "This isn't a charity," she said coldly. "If he doesn't have money, I can't help him." Isabella chuckled lightly, but kept her eyes locked on Marcella. "You talk about charity, but this isn't about that. This is about basic humanity." Joseph, who had remained silent, was overwhelmed by the scene. He had never expected someone, especially someone like Isabella, to stand up for him so fiercely. His earlier humiliation began to shift into disbelief, his eyes welling with tears. Isabella turned to Joseph, her voice soft now. "Don't worry. You can have whatever you want today." She gently pushed the few coins he had placed on the counter back toward him. "Keep these. You won't need them." Marcella, feeling her authority slip away, muttered, "Very well, ma'am. If that's what you want, so be it. But this won't happen again." Isabella smiled, unfazed. "What won't happen again, Marcella, is the way you treat people here. I'll make sure of that." The words hung in the air and Marcella's face turned pale. The other customers, who had previously stayed silent, now looked on with discomfort, clearly rethinking what they had witnessed. Joseph, regaining some dignity, was led to a table by one of the staff. Isabella followed, her eyes filled with both sadness and satisfaction. There was something about him that stirred deep empathy within her, something she couldn't quite explain. As Joseph sat down, Isabella joined him. "Now, sir," she said warmly, "what would you like to eat? Let's start with a good lunch." Joseph, still overwhelmed, murmured, "I don't know how to thank you." Isabella smiled. "There's no need for thanks, just eat." The waiter reluctantly brought Joseph's plate, a sandwich and coffee, placing it on the table without enthusiasm. But under Isabella's stern gaze, he said nothing. Joseph stared at the food for a moment, hesitant, as if unsure if it was real. "Go ahead," Isabella encouraged, her smile gentle. "It's yours. You deserve it." Joseph nodded, his eyes misty with gratitude, and slowly took a bite. The hunger he had been suppressing melted away his shame. Each bite seemed almost sacred, as if he couldn't believe this was happening. As Joseph ate, the café slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the earlier tension still lingered. Marcella, still seething from Isabella's intervention, moved away from the counter, whispering with her staff and casting occasional glares toward the table. But Isabella paid no mind to the whispers. She watched Joseph quietly, feeling something stir inside her, a deep compassion, and perhaps something more. An inexplicable connection seemed to form between them, a shared understanding that transcended the events of the day. As the café bustled around them, the simple act of kindness had changed everything. As Isabella adjusted her bag on the table, something on Joseph's wrist caught her attention. At first, it seemed insignificant, but then a flicker of recognition sparked within her. His watch, the shape, the style, it looked incredibly familiar. "Mr. Joseph?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "May I see your watch?" Joseph, confused, glanced down at his wrist as if he had forgotten he was still wearing it. "Oh, of course," he said, unfastening the strap with trembling hands. "It's a keepsake from someone very dear to me." Isabella took the watch, her fingers trembling as she examined it. Turning it over, her heart raced. Engraved on the back was a name that sent a shiver through her, Emmanuel. She brought her hand to her mouth in shock. This was the same watch she had given to the love of her life, Emmanuel, the man she had lost so tragically years ago. How did Joseph have it? "Where did you get this?" Isabella's voice trembled, her eyes fixed on the watch as if it had torn open an old wound. Joseph, sensing her sudden shift in emotion, replied, "It was a gift from my son, Emmanuel." His words hit Isabella like a wave. Her suspicions were confirmed. Joseph's son was Emmanuel, the man she had loved and lost. Her heart flooded with a mix of sadness and longing. "Emmanuel passed away many years ago," Joseph added softly, his voice filled with sorrow. "After he was gone, life was never the same." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, though she fought to remain composed. The shock of this discovery was overwhelming. Emmanuel had disappeared from her life without warning, and now here was his father, unknowingly holding a piece of her past. He was my," she began, her voice choked with emotion. Joseph, seeing the pain in her eyes, asked gently, "You knew my son?" Isabella nodded, barely able to speak. "I loved him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I loved him more than anything." A heavy silence settled between them, thick with unspoken feelings. Joseph was stunned, trying to process the revelation. Isabella clutched the watch tightly, as if afraid it might slip from her grasp, just like Emmanuel had. "Why didn't I know about you?" Joseph asked, his voice tinged with sadness. Isabella took a deep breath, her heart aching. "It's a long story," she said, looking into the eyes of the man who no longer felt like a stranger, but someone deeply connected to her past. "But now, I think we need to talk."